Good morning. On behalf of MFA and FCS Financial, I'd like to welcome everybody to the webinar this morning. I'd like to introduce myself. I am Sarah Gehring. I'm not Kate Lambert, as the screen says. Kate got called to jury duty yesterday afternoon. So while she fulfills her civic duty, I'm going to fill in for this morning and try and get everything running and going. We do have a tight timeline, so I will try and keep everything on time so that everything is concluded at 1 o'clock. If you have any questions, we do have time at the end for questions. There is a chat box and a question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to put your questions in there and we'll go through those at the end. If we run out of time, next week we will be sending out an email with a recording for this webinar, as well as a link to resource pages. So we'll answer any of those questions that you have there. With that, I'm going to turn the camera over to Adam Jones. I'll give you a little bit of background about Adam. After being raised on a farm and spending 13 years working for the Missouri Department of Conservation, Adam joined MFA Incorporated as a Natural Resources Conservation Specialist in 2019. Currently in conservation agriculture, he's working on integrating wildlife and pollinator practices, soil health, carbon quantification, and nutrient management. With that, I'm going to see if I can make technology work and turn it over to Adam.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. If you can't hear me at any point, just make sure you let me know. Turn my camera on here. So yeah, like Sarah said, my name's Adam Jones. I am conservation specialist over here at MFA Incorporated. So there is so much background to this topic, and I'm going to do my very best to cover as much of it in 20 minutes before she pulls the plug on me as I possibly can. What I want to talk about today, or what I want to try to cover, are just some soil health, some soil management practices and categories. And I'm mainly going to talk towards row crop production lands, but I think a lot of this crosses over to grazing lands too, and I want to make sure I cover kind of both sides of everything. So I will make sure I do my very best to do so. And the first thing, my token slides here. If you're not familiar with MFA Incorporated, we are an agri-service cooperative across the state of Missouri, southern Iowa, eastern Kansas, and so we typically work directly with growers, working on plant food, herbicide, custom application, and feed, kind of all sorts of in between there. And there's kind of a map there of kind of where we are. I work out of our home office here in Columbia, Missouri, and technically cover our entire trade territory. So the first thing I kind of just want to cover is general farm ownership. And I always leave the number covered up because I want you to think about kind of what you looking on our landscape, kind of what do you think kind of our typical rhetorical question here, but kind of what of our typical land ownership, how much of our farmland is now owned by someone other than the person who's actually operating that or planting the crop in this case. And nationally, it's around 41%. I think that I'm willing to bet that a significant number of you guessed higher than that. And you're looking at some data from, I think, 2016 here. So it certainly may well be higher than that, and definitely is higher than that in certain parts of the country. When we look to parts of Iowa, Illinois, really the heart of corn soybean country, that number can actually increase to into the 80% range, where 80% of the land is actually owned by somebody other than the farmer or the one who's actually operating the land. And so when we add that relationship in there, we just need to make sure that communication is the key in these relationships. And I'm going to talk about kind of how that relates to overall management of the farm here in a minute. So when we dive off into soil health, when we dive off into farm management, why does it matter, right? Why are we passionate about this topic, and kind of what has led us here? I think what you're looking at on the screen now is a global distribution of a soil order called mollisols. Now, I'm not going to go into soil taxonomy, but the important part of this is that mollisols are probably the best arable, meaning production agriculture lands in the world. And if you look at it, it's a very, very small percentage of our actual land mass, right? So less than 7% of soils in the world are of this soil order, and we just happen to have a whole bunch of them here in the United States. Now, I challenge you to look at this map and think about world powers and how many of these soils are inside certain political boundaries. And I think you're going to see a theme come up in that there is no accident as to why some of these countries are world powers. You have time to become a world power when you have super highly productive soils and you have a full belly. If you don't have a full belly, it's hard to become a world power. So as you can see, here's just a little definition of mollisol, and it is, again, some of the most productive soils that we have in the world. And we've screwed it up before. So, you know, looking at that map of all the mollisols in the United States, and I'm not saying we're headed down this same path, but you'll see historic civilizations delineated on that mollisol map too, right? So when we think of Mesopotamia, we think of the Fertile Crescent, a lot of biblical references in that part of the world. And we actually look back at a lot of these civilizations. The demise of them many times came with the demise of their agriculture program. They no longer were able to feed the population that they had accumulated in a small area. In the case of the Fertile Crescent, you're looking at modern day Iraq-ish, and it was actually destroyed by irrigation systems in a lot of cases that were put in, and they were irrigating with salt water. So they ended up with saline soils and collapsed their agriculture system. They were no longer able to feed their population. You can look at other examples of this. This is not the only one. There's tons of them. But the Mayans, for instance, you know, they were farming more on some steeper ground. Soil erosion, degraded their lands through constant cultivation, and again, were just unable to feed their growing population. And so I want to parallel that, and it doesn't directly correlate, but I want to parallel that as much as I can to our soil management in the United States. And so when we look to what happened to us, you know, most of our soils began cultivation in the mid 1800s. Some of them did, and then a whole bunch more. If you look at the steam power up here in your upper left of your screen, I believe, a whole bunch more were actually began cultivation right around World War I. And that's when we were trying to feed an army, trying to feed the Europeans as well. And so that we had a lot of soils broke out in that. And so we didn't end up with issues right away because these soils were actually very resilient. So they were under native prairie a lot of times. And so when first plowed up, they were actually very resilient soils, very, resilient to soil erosion, produced well for us. And we kind of started from there. We had a really good starting point as we go through time in agriculture. But then the bottom fell out, right? So they were resilient for a little while, and then once we did continuous tillage and continuous wheat production and a whole bunch of fallow, they started to collapse, right? So they lost that native prairie ecosystem, and they turned into something that's extremely erodible by wind or water, or just extremely not resilient to weather effects. And we ended up with a lot of the pictures that you see on your screen here. And so then that's actually Hugh Hammond Bennett, the father of it's typically called the father of soil conservation. So founded the Soil Conservation Service in the 1930s, and post that we came up with a bunch of practices, and we really thought that we had it at this point, right? If we have a little erosion, then we'll terrace the field. If we have a little erosion at the bottom of the hill, we'll put in a grass waterway. We're like, okay, we can do no-till, and that'll save us some soil as well. And we really thought we nailed it at this point. And I think as we've learned over the last 25 to 30 years here, we learned that we didn't necessarily nail it. We were closer, but we weren't exactly there yet. And so where we need to be is integrating those structural practices and the things that we've learned over the years, but also integrating the soil health principles in combination with those structural practices and those hardcore conservation practices that we kind of know from the 70s and 80s. And so really modern agriculture management, modern working toward a soil health system is really integrating those two things together. And we can certainly do that to make our soil so much more resilient. But why, right? It's a valid question. And so when we look at some of these things, they're going to line up with some of our structural practices, but creating the soil health system is much more beneficial and much more effective at accomplishing all these goals. So we're protecting the soil from rain or runoff. In that case, we're covering it with some sort of residue. We're improving soil aggregate stability. There's another technical soil term. What that means is basically aggregate stability is the soil's resistance to erosion and resistance to being detached from the ground and flowing out of the field where we don't want it in the road ditch or whatever. So if we can prove that aggregate stability, it's more resilient against those heavy rains, which we tend to get so frequently now. If we're adding active organic matter to the soil, that can increase our infiltration. Let's, think of the flooding impacts on the landscape. If every acre of agriculture land could actually infiltrate more water that falls from the sky on it, we would have much less runoff and a large decrease in the amount of flooding that we have currently on the landscape. So just some things to think about there. There's definitely some landscape positives from trying to integrate as many of these principles as we possibly can. Reducing surface crusting. We have some fairly low organic matter soils across the state of Missouri. And if you have a low organic matter soil that's been tilled and you get a rain on it, a lot of times we will crust the surface, and especially soybeans have a really hard time germinating and emerging through those conditions. So basically in all those principles, we're building resiliency, right? We're armoring our soil against rainfall events. We're armoring it against disturbance events. We're making the land more resilient. Okay, we want to keep it where it is, not wash it away, and build our microbial life, our biology in the soil at the same time. And so I want to cover each of these points in a little more depth, but we're going to go over them real quick here. And so there's a few points to soil health that I want to cover, and like I said, I think you're going to recognize how most of these could apply to your farm or whatever piece of property you may have a hand in management of. The first one I want to say is residue. We want to cover the soil as much as possible, whether that's from crop rotations or other sources, but residue is important. A living root, we want an active plant growing on there as many days as possible. And the reason we don't say 365 days is because winter happens. And so there are certain times of the year that are not a possible growing system, even across most of the state of Missouri. But we certainly want something growing out there as much as we possibly can. We want to minimize disturbance, and I'll go in and try to define what disturbance is in a little bit here. And then we want to increase diversity. And so typically when we look at diversity from a soil health perspective, we're talking about multiple different things there, and we'll go into that when we get there. So the first thing I want to cover is residue. So we want as much residue as possible. And I'm sure that I hope anyway that you've seen, if not, jump out on YouTube and look it up at some point, kind of a slow motion view of a raindrop hitting the soil surface. And if it's bare soil, how much splash there is. Just think about if you're wearing white pants and you go and stand in a worked up field during a rainstorm, you're going to have dirt all over your pants, right? Well, a lot of that's from splash erosion, essentially. So the raindrop hits the soil surface, you get a lot of deflection of soil particles up into the air. So we can divert most of that by just having residue, having something on the soil surface. And so we can affect that with crop rotation. We can have crops that have high residue, corn, wheat. And then we can also add cover crops, and some of those have high residue loads like cereal rye, which is in the picture on the top there. The living root point, let's think about this. I try to lay it out as a calendar here, right? We've got January through December. There are 12 months in a year. And many times our primary crops these days are really only actively growing for about 4 to 4.5 months of that 12-month year. And so really we've got a high disturbance event in that fallow period where we've got nothing growing out there. So if we add wheat back to the rotation, we can improve that just a little bit. And we've got something actively growing during parts of the year when corn and soybeans aren't. And that's the primary purpose of cover crops when we integrate things like cereal rye that will survive the winter and can grow at very low temperatures. What we're doing is increasing the amount of active rooting that's going on during those fallow periods when we aren't growing our cash crop. Disturbance. Disturbance, easily defined, you could say tillage, right? Well, that's the primary one that I'm talking about. Although some tillage can be absolutely necessary. Typically in a conventional system, we're possibly doing too much of it. It just depends. but there are also things that are disturbance as well, such as fallow periods, like I mentioned. I think a fallow period with nothing growing is actually a disturbance event for most of our agriculture soils. And so when we kind of think or change our mindset a little bit, thinking about disturbance, basically we want to keep the home intact for our biology, our microbes, our earthworms, all those sorts of things in the soil to really be active and provide us some benefits. And then diversity, right? So what am I talking about? Typically, plant diversity is going to equal soil diversity. And so when we look at crop rotation, we can do corn, soybeans. We typically maybe need a more diverse rotation than that. Sometimes that doesn't economically work out. But again, that's where we can integrate things like cover crops. And also, when I say diversity, I'm also defining livestock as well, right? So there are some pretty significant microbe loads in the bellies of these cows that are standing out here in the crop field. And a few times a day, they are going to number 1 or number 2 in the field, and now we got that microbial diversity in that field, right? So that's a pretty important aspect and something that we typically lack on the landscape these days, as we've removed so much of our fencing and livestock operations. But really integrating all those is where we're gonna increase the benefits from trying to build a soil health system. But we can't ignore the basics. And so there's multiple variables. There's things that we can't change. And some of these are going to dictate the degree of a soil health system that we can possibly go into. So, we can't change our soil type. Whatever our farm is what it is. If you have a lot of sand, you're going to be handcuffed a little bit in some of the practices that you have. If you have a really heavy soil, you're going to be handcuffed a little bit too. So there's some specific things that we kind of need to know. And you're looking at grid sample data on the right side there. That's soil sampling data. That's actually an organic matter layer, but that's the amount of organic material in the soil. So typically that's going to be higher on our prairie soils, but we can increase that number slowly over time. And there's also some testing that we can do for soil health. Many of those are kind of unproven at this point, but I think will be something for sure for the future that we can look to. We can also test for long-term inputs that affect our crop production, right? It's hard to build a soil health system if you're, just physically lacking in some of these plant essential nutrients that we need to grow a good crop. We need to grow a good crop to produce the residue, which is another one of the soil health principles. So like I mentioned, some of these basic things can actually be pretty extremely important. Phosphorus is extremely bound to the soil. It's extremely immobile. And so we really only remove phosphorus from the system with a crop removal, or when we actually physically erode soil. That's where we really move phosphorus around the landscape. And some of that data can lead to some great accuracy that we have in the field. And so if you haven't seen maps like these for your farm, I would encourage you to either pull some soil tests or work with a grower or work with somebody to get some soil testing data done. These are pretty cool, but you can see the difference in the phosphorus values, and then where we want to make that fertility investment. With as high as fertility is these days, we want to make sure that we're as accurate as possible. And I'll flip back and forth there a little bit. Hopefully you can see that. And then, lastly, I just kind of want to circle back to where I started or tried to start, in that a lot of times when we're talking about rented acres, we can see things go wrong sometimes, right? If folks aren't paying attention, if folks aren't in great communication with each other, sometimes that we can see these things, right? Sometimes we're less likely to invest in fertility or conservation practices, whether that's terracing, cover crops, those kind of things. And we're just more likely to make decisions that may only impact the short term on that acre. Then, the dominance of our agreements are just verbal. Many are cash rent. And so we really need to have that long-term commitment a lot of times on these acres in order to maximize some of the stewardship practices that may go into it. It's hard for me as a grower to build a soil health system on an acre that I may not have next year, if that makes sense. There are a lot of cost share dollars. There's corporate dollars now being funneled into some of these practices, some of these systems, and whether that be carbon markets or cost share through NRCS. We have a great soil and water district state cost share system. I think Haley later on here is going to cover some of those programs and practices, but just have conversations about these. If we're going to participate in a market, if we're going to participate in some cost share, supporting both sides of that relationship and just whomever is participating. How can you better partner? These are just some examples, and I'm sure some of our other speakers are going to have some great examples as well. But we really want to look to, sharing long-term investments. Sometimes some of our fertilizer builds are long-term investments, maybe lime, a pH correction, structural practices, terraces, waterways, those kind of things. Make sure all your production acres still make sense, right? If you're a landowner, is the grower making money off of every single acre in your field? And if he's not, then he's taken, then he's overproducing on some in order to pay for the ones that he's not making money on. And so same thing from a grower perspective is just trying to work with that landowner and make sure that that actually all those production acres still make sense on your farm. Helping to build a soil health system. So how do we do that? What's our first step? And I'm very, very much a believer in kind of small steps towards the building of that system. If we can simply reduce the amount of disturbance that we do, something like that can certainly go a long way in those things. And we can just, we got to start down the road before we get to our destination. And just the biggest thing, stay in communication, work as a team, addressing the issues on the farm, understanding what those issues are, and paying attention to them. And that is the last slide. I think I may have actually made it in 20 minutes. And so Sarah doesn't have to pull the plug on me. And so I very much appreciate that part. But there's my contact info if you need to take a picture of it, or both of those email addresses will get straight to me. And like I said, if you have any questions, put those, I believe she said, in the chat box or the question and answer box. And I will stop this and hopefully pass it back to Sarah.
Yes, I found the reclaim host button, Matt. So or excuse me, Adam. So we are Perfect. Good.
All right.
This box next to you.
Less responsibility for me. I like it. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And again, as Adam mentioned, if you have any questions, please put those in the chat or that question and answer box. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Haley Lockard and tell you a little bit of background about Haley. She is a Farm Bill wildlife biologist with Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever in Missouri. She works with landowners, producers, and partner organizations to improve wildlife habitat on recreational and working land. With that, Haley, I will turn it to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. Hopefully you can see my slides. So yeah, I'm just gonna build a little bit on what Adam talked about. He mentioned conservation programs, so we'll just jump right in. First off, I work with Quail Forever. We are the habitat organization. We do anything and everything to improve habitat, whether that's actual habitat on the ground or educating people or advocating for it on a legislative table, making sure that we have the cost share funds available to help people do good work. And it's all grassroots. It starts at the local level with our chapters, raising money in the local communities to spend in their local communities. And that also funds a lot of positions like my own, the boots on the ground to help landowners get some conservation activities moving forward. So the first step in anything is the technical assistance, and that's really where I come in. I meet with landowners on the farm to talk about their priorities, what their needs are, what their concerns are, and maybe if there's any, erosion problems or just want more habitat, those kinds of things. And we'll provide landowners with a conservation plan to give them the tools and the information to take that next step to make improvements. And it's completely voluntary. You guys come to us and we provide all the assistance that we can. So kind of looking at where you might want to make some improvements, it kind of starts with looking at your profit. Like, are you making money on every acre that you're farming? And just because you have high yields, you may not actually be making money on them if you're having to put in a lot of extra fertilizer or use a lot of herbicide. So be sure to take a look at your inputs. What are you spending money on? And how much money are you actually getting back from that ground? And we can use that information to educate some decisions and identify those areas that you're not making money. So on all these maps, this is based on yield data. The red is where you're losing money, and then the yellow would be your break-even point, that you're making just enough to pay for what you put into it. And then the green, of course, is where you're making money. So there's a lot of opportunities here to look on the ground at what's happening in these red areas and try to make some improvements. And one of the biggest challenges we see, especially in crop fields, is a lot of field edge effects. You notice there was a lot of red along the edges of those crop fields where your yields are lower because you've got taller vertical structure that's creating competition for moisture and sunlight and different nutrients. And it can also encourage some predation, especially from raccoons. They love having tall trees to escape to. So having tall trees right along the edge of a crop field is kind of just, a raccoon's dinner buffet. So we take into account, what's going on. Is it taller structure? Is it just low yields, poor soil health, those things? And we can try to find a balance between having yields and actually making a profit. So you could do a couple different things. This top picture is edge feathering. This is from Adam. He, spent a couple afternoons just cutting trees and letting them fall. You remove that direct competition, but you're also creating excellent small game habitat. Or you could completely remove those acres from production and plant a, diverse native grass and wildflower area, like in this bottom picture, and put those yields towards other acres. There's been studies that have shown that these native plantings along crop fields attract beneficial pollinators that can actually increase your yields on other crops. So it can create a really good balance and win-win situation, and just makes dollars and cents to maybe use low production crop ground for other uses, whether that's wildlife habitat or putting it into a hay forage or other use. So that gets into where the financial assistance comes in. Doing these conservation activities can be expensive and daunting, but there is financial cost share available out there. So we'll jump into some of those right now. The first being federal level through the Farm Bill, and then some state programs that are available. So I'll jump right into the first one through the federal Farm Bill is your Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP for short. Now this is NRCS's flagship program. It's the one we use the most, and it's typically a contract with the landowner, but as long as you're the operator and have control, for however long that contract is, you can also, you do an EQIP contract. So basically, we have applications are accepted year round, and what you're getting is a one-time flat rate payment to implement a conservation practice. Now we have hundreds of conservation practices that we provide, whether that's terraces or cover crops or native wildflower plantings, ponds and grazing systems, or there's just an entire list of practices we can do through EQIP to help get conservation on the ground. And it's a flat rate payment, but it's typically approximately 75% of what we expect your implementation costs to be. And again, you can make improvements to pretty much any conservation concern that we have. And another big one through NRCS is the Conservation Stewardship Program. So this program was designed to kind of give you a pat on the back for the good conservation you're already doing, and encourage you to take it to the next level or take it a step further to do even more. And what's unique about this program is that it is based on who the operator of your land is. So the operator can be the landowner, but it could be the farmer that rents the ground also. So it's unique in that way that it's for the operator. And again, applications are accepted year round, but these contracts are 5 years. And you'll receive an annual payment based on, the good work for conservation you're already doing. And then they provide some cost share to take things to the next step or address new issues. So what's unique about CSP is that it takes into account your entire operation, all of the land that you are listed as the operator on. Every farm, every tract is assessed and looked at for conservation practices that you're doing, as well as where you can improve. So kind of the big thing with CSP is that you have to meet 2 resource concerns right now, and then you'll have to meet 1 by the end of your contract. So as an example, if you currently have a crop field that's doing no-till, you've got a good crop rotation, and you're incorporating cover crops, you're probably meeting all of the soil health and water quality resource concerns, but maybe you're not meeting wildlife habitat. So we can implement a wildlife habitat planting and some edge feathering to meet that resource concern by the end of the contract. So at the end of 5 years, you're meeting 3 resource concerns. And then the big one and most popular, of course, on crop ground is the Conservation Reserve Program that's been around for over 30 years. It's administered by the Farm Service Agency, or FSA, and you get a yearly payment for taking ag land out of production and establishing a permanent vegetation, whether that's grass, or there are some practices that do trees for like riparian buffers and things like that. So it does require a cropping history. So it has to have been cropped 4 of the 6 years between 2012 and 2017. So that's for the current Farm Bill. The next Farm Bill that should likely start in 2024 will have different cropping history years requirements, and lands enrolled in CRP maintain that cropping history. They're kind of considered cropped for those purposes. And these are longer contracts. So they're either 10 or 15 years, and you're getting an annual payment based on your specific soil types. And this year they made changes that a lot of the rates have gone up. And there's also extra incentives available that make it quite lucrative to enroll in CRP. So here's a look at the top 10 average soil rental rates from Missouri. As you can see, over the 150 mark, and there's actually some soil types that are over the $200 mark. So it can be quite lucrative to include those non-productive lands into CRP. Now, some of the basics, you do get cost share for establishing the cover, and you are expected to control all the noxious weeds, whether that's Canada thistle or autumn olive or Sericea lespedeza is a big one. You have to keep it, in the approved cover, and you have to maintain it in a farmable state. You need to control the trees, and then there's some management practice requirements to make sure you're maintaining the diversity of that cover, and it's valuable for not only soil health but also wildlife habitat and other conservation benefits. So there's kind of 2 big CRP categories that we work in. The first is general, which is a lot of your whole field enrollments. And with general, you're submitting an offer that says, this is what I will accept for a payment per acre. Here's the covered type I'm willing to put in, whether that's, cool season grasses or warm season grasses or a tree practice. You're outlining what you want to do. And then your offer is ranked against all offers in the country. And at a national level, they pick a point value, and everything above that will be accepted, and then you'll get a contract. Conversely, through the continuous CRP, is typically your portions of the fields, whether that's filter strips or waterways, prairie strips and riparian buffers, a lot of field edges or partial fields, and it's automatically accepted. As long as we have acres under the CRP acreage cap, you automatically get accepted. And there's a lot of incentives with these, especially for climate smart practices that address carbon sequestration and water quality. So this is, again, a really great option for those areas that are not making you money on crop ground. And to kind of return back to these yield maps, this farm in particular, all the red acres, there's 48 acres that are not making money. So if we enrolled that in CRP, you could get an annual payment of almost $7,000 a year. So over a 10-year contract, you've got $70,000 in your pocket versus spending thousands and thousands of dollars on inputs to try to get a yield that you may still be losing money on. So CRP really provides a great opportunity for you to farm the best and then conserve the rest and put it into other uses. So kind of moving away from the federal programs and turning to state monies. The Missouri Department of Conservation has what they call their Landowner and Community Assistance Program. So it's run through MDC, and they provide cost share to private landowners to enhance fish, forest, and wildlife habitats. And the cost share is less than what you get for federal, but it's really good for small projects, for people that want to step their toes into the waters with cost share programs and just see how it works and what the system looks like. Again, and then in partnership with the Department of Conservation through Quail Forever and our local chapters, we have what we call the Habitat Challenge Grant that again does quail focused work and follows all the same practices as LCAP, which is very similar to EQIP. So pretty much anything you want to do for habitat, we can find a way to pay for it at the state level. And then kind of, I want to put a plug in too also for the Missouri Outdoor Recreational Access Program, or MRAP. It's a great option to kind of tack on to some of these other programs if you've done conservation work and created some good, habitat or conservation areas on your farm. You can get a payment from MDC every year to open your property up to public use for hunting, fishing, wildlife viewing. There's lots of different access types, but you're not limited on your property what you can do. You can still fish and hunt and farm it and use your land the way you want to use, but then provide that extra opportunity to the public to enjoy the outdoors. And again, that can be $15 to $25 an acre on top of what you're already getting for CRP. And then if you do extra habitat work, you can get extra incentives also. So it's just another kind of tack on program that I wanted to make sure you were all aware of. Again, there's 6 access types you can choose from. So you can choose what people are allowed to do, whether that's only walking around and wildlife viewing or allowing them to do all hunting, fishing, those kinds of things. So I went through that pretty fast, and the programs get complicated and confusing, but I just want you to understand that there's a lot of opportunities out there. The Federal Farm Bill provides our most popular and most substantial programs that do a lot of good work on the ground. But the first step is to identify your goals and what you need to improve on your property or what your priorities are, and then work with your local USDA offices or other technical advisors to discuss the programs that are best suited to you, because it's not a one size fits all. CRP may not work for everybody, but if there's acres that you do want to convert to native habitat, maybe EQIP works better for you to have a 1-year contract, get the work done and move on. And of course, our Farm Bill biologists, such as myself, we've got 12 of them across the state, and that's one of our primary goals, is to help you navigate those programs and work through that. So thank you very much. Please connect with us at Missouri QF, and I will turn it back over. Get this open up.
Thank you, Haley. She shared a lot of good information there. With that, our next speaker is Brent Hayden, who's going to speak with us about leases. And I will send this to Brent and then give you a little bit about his bio. Haley, you may have to quit sharing your screen. I think we're still viewing that. Brent is born and raised in rural Mexico, Missouri, on a cow, calf, and quarter horse farm. He attended the University of Missouri for his undergraduate degree and Harvard Law School. In the past, he has served in lobbying and legal roles for agricultural associations, and in 2011 founded his law firm in Columbia, Missouri. He's focusing on agricultural law in his practice. He represents both landowners and producers in negotiating and enforcing crop and pasture leases. With that, I will turn it over to Brent.
Well, thank you, Sarah. I'm going to get my screen shared here. I got my bio in late to Sarah, and Sarah and I grew up at 4-H together, so she knows enough about me that I figured I better get my bio in because she could tell the rest of the truth that make it a lot more interesting. So
I was prepared.
you're ready to do it if you had to. So let me play this real quick here. So I want to talk just quickly here about farm lease agreements and some considerations, because I know that the audience today, we're really focusing on landowners and things landowners can do. I know some of you as landowners may be producers, but also I'm sure some of you as landowners have tenants that are doing the actual production work on ag ground. And so just want to talk through some of the considerations, particularly in light of the topic today, where we're talking about, environmental best practices and soil conservation. Just kind of as a background, we've really had some flux in the agricultural economy with a lot of things that are going on. Sometimes some of it's long-term trends, obviously. More people are, farming ground that they don't own. They're as tenants, and obviously, conversely, a lot of landowners are not directly involved in production agriculture anymore. They may have inherited ground or taken on ground as an investment. And so the actual farming is falling to someone local doing it under contract or under lease. Obviously, because land value and commodity prices have generally been on the rise over the last 15 years and sometimes very significantly. Land prices are up. They're obviously now in another upward trend, like everything else with inflation. They're likely to go higher. And, the general trend we've also seen is that more arable land has been turned out of pasture into tillage, and those tillable acres are fetching a premium. And obviously, we all know, we've all been by and seen, I'm sure, pieces of ground that are being tilled that probably shouldn't be, as to both the soil health and just the profitability, but they are. With more of those dollars chasing those acres, there's been a move to replace livestock tenants with crop tenants because, in general, there's more money to be made there. But also with the movement, I think we're about to see another round of aggressive termination, because I think cash rents are probably about to go up again with the rise in land value. You're starting to see more terminations. You're seeing fights over terminations, obviously, where the terms for termination are ambiguous on the legal side with what I deal with. And so, and all that's kind of coming together to increase the importance. It's more important than ever for everybody, producers and landowners, to get their leases in writing and create some certainty in terms. I wanted to, and because of that, I want to talk about oral versus written formation leases just briefly, because there are still plenty of acres being farmed out there in Missouri on an oral year-to-year lease. Oral year-to-year leases obviously come with a lot of problems. They are generally enforceable. Some people will call me and say, are they enforceable? They are enforceable, but they're only enforceable on a year-to-year basis. Missouri, like every other state in the country, has an underlying, what they call a statute of frauds. And one of the things that our statute of frauds requires is that any contract that affects real estate, so that includes any lease, if it has a term of more than a year, it has to be in writing, or it generally will not be enforceable. And I cite in this slide here to revised section 432.010 that lays that out. Now, with that said, even where you have a longer term lease that's oral, courts will often enforce those, particularly to the benefit of tenants, if the tenant has shown substantial performance. So if the tenant, in other words, if they have paid and they've done everything they said they would do, they come into court and say, well, I thought this was on a 5-year lease and I've been doing everything I was supposed to do. Sometimes, and it's variable, but sometimes courts have said, yes, that's still enforceable. They're not so forgiving or generous to the landowner on the landowner side. I mean, if you want to hold a tenant to something beyond a year, you're going to need to get it in writing. And really, in today's day and age, you should be getting these things in writing. You should be getting written leases. I know in the country, people don't like to do them, but anytime you're doing a land lease, a real estate lease that has multiple years in it, which most people do now, You need to get that in writing for enforceability, but you also need to get it in writing because it just gives you certainty in terms of how long is it going to last? What's the termination date? What are the operating conditions under which that the producer has to operate? You know, if you want to impose conditions as to conservation conditions or any other condition. And also just gives you some certainty on what are the enforcement mechanisms if somebody doesn't perform? What happens if you don't get paid? What happens if they violate one of the conditions of the underlying lease? So you need to get it in writing. The days of just the handshake and we'll do it year to year have really gone by us, and you're really putting yourself at a disadvantage if you don't look to get a writing in place. And it's really what this slide's about. Just everything I've said here. Make sure you get it in writing, and make sure you understand what you're getting in writing. Work with your attorney, or and make sure you understand exactly what the terms are. Now, I do want to put the slide in front of you on how termination works, and this applies to the oral year-to-year lease, just so everybody is aware. Our statute 441.050 says that either party can terminate a year-to-year tenancy, like an oral ag lease, if by giving notice in writing of the intention to terminate the same 60 days before the end of the year. In Missouri, there's always, it's kind of tenuous in the law. Are we looking at a calendar year or an agricultural year? And the courts have enforced it both ways. Normally what they'll look to is where was the first check and payment made. And so if you've got a beginning of the year, like a January 1 or a December 31 payment for the next year, they'll say, okay, that was an annual calendar year lease. And so the termination to get out of that lease would need to be sent by the end of October. In fact, Halloween's always a big day for us around here. That's one of the days, we know that for clients that want to terminate an oral lease for the next year, we have to have the letters out by that day. The alternative normally is like a March 1 lease. There are some March 1 leases people will pay in early March to get into, crop ground or even pasture, but particularly crop ground for the spring. And so sometimes you go back and you look on an oral lease, that first check fell at the beginning of March. And so courts will say, okay, I think it's a March 1 lease, and you need to terminate by the calendar year. And so in other words, by December 31, if you want to terminate for that next year, you need to have sent notice. Now, if there is agreement, if you have a written agreement that says when a date, it gives a date certain for the end of a lease, you don't have to provide notice of termination. And this is one more reason to get a written lease if you're a landowner. So if you're a landowner who's made a lease that says this lease will terminate on December 31 of 2021, or sometimes even people will set December 1, it's an end of harvest lease. When everything should be out by December 1. This lease will terminate on December 1, or this lease will terminate. I've seen pasture leases that terminate on July 15, so the very end of a spring grazing period. If you have a written lease that sets out a date certain, you don't have to send an additional termination notice. It's just a contract like any other contract, and the lease terminates on that day. And so it's one more trouble-free way if you put these things in writing to ensure that you're going to have termination in a timely manner. Now, there's business considerations for both the tenant and the landowner, but particularly for the landowner when you draft these farm leases. One big thing is term. How long do you want this to be? So assuming you're not going to do just an oral year-to-year lease or just a one-off a year-to-year lease, are you looking at 3 years? Are you looking at 5 years? Are you looking at 7 years? How long do you want this to be? A longer term obviously gives you more security in terms of income. And if you've got a tenant you like, it ties in a tenant that you like for a longer window. A shorter term obviously gives you more flexibility. One of the downsides, particularly where there's an uptrend in price just financially for a longer term lease, obviously, is that you may be tied in at a lower amount in terms of what you're paid compared to what you could get, by having a 3-year lease. At the end of those 3 years, you can hook into a higher price that's come out, that's out there in the fair market much quicker than a 7-year lease, which ties you in. You can't utilize that higher rate coming in. The other side of that, though, and and a tenant has the same considerations. The other side of it is there is more long-term certainty in where you're at, both into price and into what tenant you've got. The other thing to remember as a landowner with a term is that a tenant getting a longer term lease is often much more willing and much more compliant to tie into things like conservation practices. because and soil fertility and soil health and everything else. When you've given them a longer window, they've got a much bigger incentive to play ball there, because it actually normally comes back to their pocketbook if they're engaging in best practices. That's why the further west you go, I used to work some in Kansas, and in Kansas, it was very common to see 10-year pasture leases because the ground's much drier there. They get the acres per head efficiency isn't nearly as good. And, getting in that kind of long window ensures the tenant has an incentive to help really take care of the ground, because it'll come back to their pocket. Obviously, another major business consideration in farm leases is price. Obviously, everybody wants to get as much money as they can out of the ground, but you can also leverage price in either direction. I mean, sometimes a tenant may say, well, I'm especially with conservation practices, I'm happy to participate in and help in that conservation practice, but it's going to require more labor out of me. I want to do it, but I need to pay a little bit less because there's going to be a little bit more work. But if, those practices are a priority to you, and I think many of the people on the call today, they probably are, maybe worth it to take a little less to get a tenant that will be conscientious in their cooperation. Final thing, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, is the reserve uses. You want to make sure that you are reserving the uses in writing for yourself that you may have and may want on that ground. So if and there's all sorts of things that may tie into, but if there's something you're definitely going to want to use that ground for, you need to make sure you reserve rights of reentry and make it clear you still have the right to use the ground as a landowner for a given purpose. Some other considerations in drafting these leases, we've talked about building and fixture maintenance really has the same consideration. A longer term gives you more security, a shorter term gives you more flexibility. A more aggressive term may be leveraged off price if you're going to put the building and that need to maintain buildings and fixtures on the property on the tenant. They may want to pay a little less. Conversely, if you're going to take care of it, they may be able to pay more. So that's obviously a big thing to think about, just like in any lease. Obviously, you also want to talk about with your price, are you on a crop share or on a cash basis? Crop sharing obviously comes with all sorts of attendant benefits and risks. You can tie to the price of rising commodity prices, but you also are on the hook. I mean, any of these leases that I've ever worked on with a crop share lease, you also share some responsibility for input costs with the farmer. So you're also taking on the risk of those increased input costs. Tied to that question is who gets FSA payments on a cash basis. Obviously, landowner is not really involved in the FSA payments that may come in on the farming side. Traditionally, I mean, you can make a contract that says anything, but that's the conventional way of doing it. On the other hand, if you're in a crop share, then you also share in the benefits and spoils and burdens of the FSA payments. You want to think about what you want done with the timber. Are they keeping timber rights? Can that farmer take timber out? Do they have to leave timber intact? Do they even have access to the timber? On a grazing lease, do you have special rules on access to timber? Really, along with building fixture maintenance, you talk about terracing and erosion management and NRCS cost sharing, all those things. Are you going to share in that, or is that going to go entirely to the tenant? And again, on a longer term lease, it's easier to say that all belongs to the tenant, but then he has more incentive. On a shorter term lease, you definitely may want to be tying in. As a landowner, you bear some of the expense, but you also take on some of the benefit. Fertility management and liming on the property, we often have a split on that, especially in pasture leases, between fertility, like fertilizer, which normally is a short-term input that you put on the tenant, versus lime, which is a more long-term input that in a shorter-term lease would be normally borne by the landowner. Although in a longer-term lease, a 5, 7, 10-year lease, you may say, hey, this is a long-term benefit, and tenant, you need to take care of the lime. It's whatever you can negotiate to. If you're leasing for livestock operations, dead disposal can be a big deal because that's a major environmental compliance area for livestock, and especially intensive livestock operations. You want to make sure you've got an agreement on that. You want to have have something in the term on whether a producer can sublease or not. And usually as a landowner, you're going to want to at least the right of approval to who they would sublet to. And then also you want to cover who's going to pay insurance and taxes. A couple things considered that are a big deal, particularly from the landowner side. And I talked about this earlier, but let's talk about it in detail. You need to specifically reserve your rights of reentry on the property. A lot of landowners are surprised to know that without a specific reservation of a right to enter a property under a lease, they have no rights of reentry. So the law basically says when you lease that property off to somebody else, unless you specify by contract the reasons that you get to reenter the property as a landlord, you effectively have no right of reentry. You have lost possession of the property for the term of the lease, and that tenant can do what they want with it outside of, a very few narrow things. They can't intentionally destroy property on it. They can't engage in waste where they just, they actually let the asset completely waste away. But in the farm context, those are very seldom an issue. And basically a tenant can completely shut you out of the property if you haven't reserved the right to reentry. Now, most tenants are smart enough to know on a short-term lease, if they do that to you, you're probably going to terminate them next year. And so it's rarely an issue, but a lot of times, for example, in the last year of a lease where a tenant knows they're going to be terminated, they start playing hardball because they know it's their last year anyway. And I've been on both sides of those disputes where a tenant just says, well, fine, I know I'm out of here next year. You're banned from the property. You can't hunt it this year, or whatever the case may be. And this is the big thing, particularly, obviously, a lot of folks who are in Missouri who are absentee landowners are buying property for recreational purposes. They want to hunt it, fish it, just be able to go out there, camp, ride four-wheelers around, ride horses, whatever they want to do. If you need to reserve those recreational purposes, you need to have in the lease that you can re-enter at any time or specific times you agree on with the tenant to hunt, fish, engage in recreation, camp, whatever the case may be. You need to have that laid out in writing. Same thing if you want to monitor improvements, and this ties in importantly into where we're talking about environmental best practices. If you've imposed environmental best practices conditions in your lease on your producer, so you told that farmer, hey, you're going to have this piece in waterways, you're going to have feathered edges over here, we want to get quail habitat over here in this corner, whatever it is, whatever's in that lease. If you want to have a right of reentry to inspect and make sure that they're actually doing what they said they would do, so you can enforce if they're in breach, you need to have that right of reentry in there to say, like, hey, I can reenter this property to check for compliance with conservation best practices that you've agreed to put in place. And on that point, we're talking about enforcing best environmental and sustainability practices. You need to get the specific requirement in writing that they're going to do that. So before we were talking about rights of reentry, you need to put those in specific writing so that you can reenter and check. But to the underlying point, if you want to require best environmental and sustainability practices from your tenant, you need to lay out those requirements in writing. It's particularly true if you want them to go above and beyond the standard FSA and NRCS requirements. I mean, the federal government and USDA already on the subsidy side, and this is particularly important for crop farmers, they already lay in some requirements to even be eligible to get paid. You can be kicked out of the program and not paid if you violate certain environmental best practices. But their list certainly is not as exhaustive as some people who want to go above and beyond in terms of habitat management. If you're in northern parts of northern and western Missouri, you really want to get engaged heavily in prairie restoration, for example, which is becoming a bigger thing for a lot of people. And you want to impose some of those requirements into an operation, all those sorts of things. I mean, the FSA and USDA requirements don't really touch a whole lot of those areas. And so if you're going to say, you've got to do X, Y, and Z to create more deer habitat or more pheasant habitat, or I've already made it, in many cases, I've already made a contract with a private or a public entity with MDC or whoever it may be, that this has to be done on the property. But now I want you as the producer to acknowledge that you understand that and you're going to follow that practice. That needs to be in writing. It's not going to be good enough on the enforcement side if you say, yeah, we got a handshake deal. He kind of understood how the habitat piece was supposed to work. In 2 years, you determine there's a breach. It's going to be hard to go back and get enforcement on that against the tenant unless you've got it in writing that they know this was a requirement for them as they farm the property under the lease. And with that, you also want to make sure you set out in writing the enforcement and penalty mechanisms if they fail to comply. And if you want to give them incentives for compliance, where you say, you kept up these best practices, I really like that, and we're going to give you a discount on the rent, or we're going to send a little money back at the end of the year. I've done leases like that. That can be done. You obviously want to make sure you get that in writing as well. So you can see a theme here. I know it sounds like a broken record, but you really need to get these things in writing rather than just doing them on a handshake or a head nod, at the day you go and you hand the keys over, if you want to avoid problems down the road. Make sure that your tenant knows what your expectations are, and that you've got an enforceable document in hand that requires them to do it. And if they don't do it, then you've got a cause to go back and declare breach and, get it out of the lease and give it to somebody who will do that. And also understand on the other side of that, because you are imposing an extra cost that is not required under the law specifically, there may be a little discount, in terms of what you get back in terms of the rent to find the right tenant. But that can be worth it if you've got somebody who's compliant and will do a good job, and obviously ties into these other issues that are a priority on your property in terms of its long-term soil health and long-term conservation health. So it's just a big thing to think about. I mean, you want to get a lease in place that's a written lease, has clear and enforceable terms, lays out your expectations for conservation practices by your tenant, and also lays out both the consequences and incentives for the compliance. I mean, if they fail to comply, there's consequences. If they do comply, then there's, you put a little sugar in there, maybe a carrot to help them create an environment where it makes sense for them to comply. And you just want those terms to be unambiguous. And nobody really ever once they have a dispute says, I wish this lease wasn't so detailed. Everybody hates reading them on the front end, but we like clarity on the back end. Both you will and your attorney will, if you have to ever take it to legal action, to say, no, this was a clear requirement to be imposed on that producer. So that's what I had today. I really appreciate the chance to talk with you all about this. And I just think that there's a lot of great information today, and a lot of things that are very helpful to producers and to landowners if you get clarity in writing and you get good expectations set for everybody involved.
Thank you, Brent. He did a great job of outlining what needs to be in our written lease. I really appreciate your time today. With that, our last speaker of the morning is Matt, I guess it's afternoon now, is Matt Cars. Matt was raised on a cow-calf farm around Houstonia, Missouri. Let me make him the host. He works here at our FCS Financial office in Sedalia. He's been with us for over 10 years in lending and insurance experience. And I guess he joined us in 2012 again in our Sedalia office. So with that, Matt, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Sarah, and get everything going here. You can see my presentation, correct, Sarah?
Yes, I can.
Okay, super. All right. Well, again, thank you guys for joining us today. Appreciate the opportunity to present some high-level financing options around some of the land and improvements that you may want to do on some of your properties. There's my contact information there. You'll see it again at the end of this. So if you miss it, we can go over that again. Let's see here. Just jump right into it. Some of the things I'm going to cover today is just kind of an overview of how do I find a lender for farmland? What is the process for obtaining a loan? What types of loans are available to work with farmer tenants or to add improvements to the farmland? Some people haven't gone through the process of obtaining loans before, so we'll kind of go through that process as well at, like I said, a very high level. So let's talk about finding a lender real quick. I'll just save you a whole bunch of Googling and time. Give us a call, FCS Financial. There's our website there, myfcsfinancial.com. It's kind of your one-stop shop. There's our 1-800 number there. Call us wherever you're at in the state of Missouri. We can find the right branch, right location, right loan officer to help answer any questions that you have. There's a screenshot of our website there, so you know you're at the right place when you can get it. Kind of goes over all of our services, products, loans, even some resources for you as far as filling out some of the information, some YouTube videos. So it's a great resource for you there. Okay, so some people may not be familiar with who FCS Financial is, so we'll kind of go over that real quick. We are Missouri's largest agricultural lender. We are a member-owned cooperative, and we provide financing and insurance services to eligible farmers, ranchers, and rural homes. You can even expand that into recreational land and lot loans as well. So it doesn't have to be necessarily agricultural loans, as long as it's somehow related to ag or real estate outside of city limits. Your big cities and things like that, we can pretty much finance just about anything for a traditional farmer and part-time farmer. So FCS Financial has given over $1.5 million to 4-H and FFA organizations because we're an ag-focused company. A lot of our employees and members, kids are in 4-H and FFA. We find it very valuable to give back to our community. We also have donated over 2,000 hours of our time to our communities as well. We have $4 billion in rural loans, leases, and related services. And because we're a cooperative, we have given back to our customers over $180 million returned in patronage as well, which is a huge thing for us, and we're really proud to be able to do that. So for those of you that are in Missouri or have land in Missouri, we have 21 branch locations throughout the state. We serve over 102 counties, currently around 15,000 plus member owners. We're served by 15 directors. Those directors are elected from our member owners, and we have around 255 employees that can help serve your needs. So if you are nearby any of those locations, feel free to stop in, call in, or reach out to anybody to find any financing needs or ask any questions that you may have at that time. So we'll kind of dive into obtaining a loan, the nitty-gritty of the whole presentation here. So, like I said, some people may not have gone through the application process before. Some people may have. For the most part, it's pretty standard. We're going to keep this at a very high level. Every situation is going to be a little different. Every loan request may look a little different for what you're wanting to do and what your needs are. But from a high level, you're going to start out with reaching out to somebody at one of our offices. We're going to get you an application packet. That'll be electronic or paper. We even have some online applications now for certain kinds of loans. We're going to request some financial information, your balance sheet, some tax returns, some pay stubs. Many people that are landlords work off the farm, so we're going to want some pay stubs as well. If you're a full-time farmer, may not apply. So additional information, if we're looking at real estate loans, most of the time we're going to ask you for a legal description of your property. If you're buying property, we're going to ask for a contract. If it's a refinance, we may not need a contract on something like that, obviously, but we will want a legal description so that we can get that appraisal going and things like that once we get you through the underwriting process. We're going to ask about some of your farm scope so we can kind of understand your needs and what your operation goes through. Some people are livestock producers, some are crop producers. You may be a landlord investor. So we kind of want to understand what your needs are so we can find the right products for you. Set up those terms that match cash flows based on how your operation works. Maybe you've got some entities. Maybe it's an LLC or a trust. Maybe it's an operating only. A lot of those kind of things matter on how we structure the loan. So it helps us help structure that loan to fit your needs as well. And maybe you're wanting to build, say, a machine shed or a hunting cabin or something on there. We offer construction loans as well, and I'll kind of touch on some of those things as well for you. But we'll want some bids and plans so that we can to get that, very similar to maybe building a home or some CAFO or something like that on a property. If that's part of your long-term goals to retire on a property and have a farm, your house and everything out there, we can certainly do construction to permanent loans and things like that. So once we have all of your financial information, your application packet's ready, your loan officer is going to send the packet into a credit analyst and get the approval process going. Once you're approved, typically on real estate, we'll order the appraisals and title work to make sure we don't have any unwritten leases or any issues with your title work. Once we have all that stuff back, then we're going to get your closing set. That whole process, on average, I'm going to say somewhere between 30 and 45 days for real estate. Now, there are some different kinds of loans out there that we may maybe able to do some short-term financing that's not related to real estate as collateral. We can get those done much quicker than that as well. So really depends on what the scenario is and what your request is. But for a typical transaction, you're somewhere between 30 and 45 days from start to finish once a completed application is done. So what types of terms are available? You know, the kinds of loans that we offer are a little different than a traditional lender. We can offer up to 30-year terms if say your primary dwelling is part of the request. If it's bare land, you might be looking at up to a 20-year term. Like I said, every request is going to be a little different depending on what it is we're looking at, what we're financing. We've got some different terms, and that's where reaching out to your FCS branches will be helpful to be able to kind of dial that in a little bit. Maybe you want a 1-year term or a 5-year term on some things. We can certainly offer those things as well. So we offer different types of rate products. You might be familiar with some of the adjustable rates or variable rate products, but we offer a full true fixed rate product. It's fixed for the entirety of the loan. A lot of our products have no prepayment penalties to them, so if you pay them off early, that's great. The fixed rate really is a great mitigation tool for risk. So if you're a full-time farmer, or if you're just a landlord that has wanted to maybe improve some of your land, and you're on a fixed cash rent scenario, and you want that cash rent to go towards your payments, we can certainly set that up, and a fixed rate product is a great way to go for something like that. So you know that payment is going to be the same from day one to the day you pay that off. The adjustable rates are also available. You know, that's a rate that's locked in for a shorter term. It does reprice at set intervals. So maybe you wanted a 20-year term to meet your cash flow, but you're a little bit more accepting of what the markets are doing. So you want to lock that in for maybe 5 years at a time, and then every 5 years look at that rate again. You can certainly do that as well. And then a variable rate is something that's a little bit more market averse. It's going to follow that market a little bit more closely and has the ability to fluctuate on a monthly basis. We do offer repayment schedules to meet your cash flow needs. If you're primarily a wage earner and you get all of your income on a monthly basis and you want your loans to be structured monthly to make those payments, we can certainly do that. If you want to structure this loan in a way that, like maybe we mentioned before, your cash rent comes in semi-annually in the spring and fall, or maybe once a year, we can certainly do that as well. So we can kind of match that cash flow to kind of meet your needs, and hopefully that works in your favor that way. Down payment is the biggest question most people ask us, you know, how much down for certain things. You know, really it's going to depend on what kind of equity positions you're at. If we're refinancing or if it's a purchase, you know, typically you're looking somewhere between 20 and 35% down, depending on the different type of request. So there's quite a range, and there are programs out there. As Haley mentioned, you know, some of those FSA programs or equip programs, things like that with some cost share. We may set those up with different kind of down payment structures as well. Beginning farmer loans are something that we do a lot of. Those are loans where there's a 5% down or maybe no % down. So again, reaching out to your loan officer in those kind of scenarios will be a great resource to kind of help guide you down the path on which way we're going to go from a down payment standpoint. And then again, products. We can do just about anything for agriculture, from farm real estate to purchase and refinance land, recreational property. If you want to buy a piece of hunting ground, or some area for fishing, or just go sit out in the woods, you can do that. Rural homes. You know, a lot of lenders are unable to finance larger tracts of land. Maybe you're not a full-time farmer, but you want to own 100 acres and a house out in the country. We can certainly do that for you with no restrictions to the amount of acres. Construction loans. In my opinion, we are a well-hidden secret, and we need to do a better job of getting this out to people. Our one-time construction closing is fantastic. It helps save some closing costs for you. You know, basically you can start out from start to finish, get a year's worth of construction period, and then convert your loan over into a fixed rate without the hassle and the headache of a refinance. So those are great options as well. And that goes for anything from building a home, putting on a cabin, doing some fencing if it's significant. You know, you want to build a machine shed, put some grain bins out there, put your hunting cabin out on a property. We can certainly help do those things as well. And if you want to expand into purchasing some machinery or livestock, we've got some short-term loans that are very competitive. We can set those structures up to meet your cash flow as well. And then operating loans, though, that would probably be more for people that may be more involved in their operation or their land. You know, we want to make sure that those inputs are going towards your actual farm production. But we can certainly set up something if you're doing some crop share structures and things like that to help aid in some of the cost on those. So that really kind of wraps up most of my presentation. Again, there's our information there. Reach out to us with any questions that you have. I know that was pretty quick at a very high level. So please give us a holler if you do have questions in the future. Reach out to any branch. Appreciate everybody's time and willingness to look into this. I think learning some of this stuff, I've learned a lot. So hopefully we can answer any questions. Please feel free to reach out to me in the future. And I'll hand it over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Matt. We appreciate all that information. Again, I do want to remind folks that there's the chat box. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to put them in there. The questions will only go to myself and the speakers, so you won't be putting them out for the whole world to see. But if you do have a question, go ahead and put that in there. I want to thank our speakers for keeping everything on track today and keeping everything on time. Do want to remind everybody that there will be a follow-up email coming out in the next week or so, and that will have a recording for this webinar, which is good to watch up to for the next 60 days. And then we'll also have resources where we'll get everybody's slides and put that information on those pages for you. With that, I know Adam worked with Kate on this from MFA. Adam, were there any closing remarks that you wanted to make?
No, I don't think anything specific, Sarah. Just appreciate the opportunity to do this. Appreciate working together, and thanks for everybody listening. And feel free to share that link with the video if you know somebody who might benefit from some of the good stuff that Brent, Haley, and Matt and everybody talked about today. So
thanks. With that, we haven't had any questions come in, so I want to go ahead and thank everybody for all of your time. And again, be looking for that email here in the next week. If you have any questions, reply to any of the reminder emails that you receive from Kate, and she'll be sure to get to those. But she is checking her emails at the end of every day. So thanks, and I hope everybody has a great day.